Hi guys, I'm Kristen and this is Kristen is Fully Booked. Today I wanted to have just a casual chat about rereading, and I wanted to share with you all of the series and books that I have reread a million times. So I'm a huge rereader, and if you've been following my channel for a while, that probably isn't going to come as a big surprise to you because I do talk fairly often about various books that I am rereading or rereading parts of. But I'm always surprised to hear from other readers or from other booktubers that they aren't rereaders, and I find that such an interesting thing. So today I wanted to have a casual chat about why I love to reread books, what the motivation or the drive behind rereading is for me, and I wanted to share with you those books in the series that I find myself rereading all of the time, both my OG rereading books that I have been rereading for more than half my life and some of the ones that I have been exposed to in the past couple years that I'm already a big rereader of. So I think whether or not you are a rereader is going to depend a lot on your motivations behind reading. If you are someone who wants to be exposed to every possible book that's out there, all of the various different stories, different takes on the world, different experiences, all of those things, like if that variety and the idea of wanting to read everything that you possibly can out there is part of a motivator for why you are such a big reader or for why you read in the first place, then rereading probably doesn't make sense to you. You've heard what that author wanted to say, you've been exposed to that story, and whether or not you liked it, rereading that and reliving that experience might not be a priority for you or might seem like a waste of time because you've already been exposed to that, and seeing new things that are out there is more of a priority to you. For me personally, I read a lot for enjoyment, for comfort, for a little bit of escapism. And so rereading a book that I know that I love is not a big deal for me. I don't see it as a waste of time because it is a moment that I can connect further with characters that I know that I love. I don't have that feeling of needing to read as much as I possibly can. Yes, there are so many books out there. They are constantly being released every single day. There is a huge backlog in the world of books that are possible to read, and always new books coming out there. So I don't have that feeling of wanting to read everything that I possibly can because I know that I'm never going to get caught up. I know that I'm never going to read everything that there possibly is. I would like to be exposed to as many stories as I can, but at the same time, because so much of my motivations for reading are about enjoyment, rereading books that I know I'm going to get that feeling out of is not a waste of time for me. I don't feel guilty about rereading at all. There are certain characters and worlds that are so familiar to me that they feel like old friends. And in fact, I have a problem with wanting to reread constantly because, you know, when you think or talk about a friend that you haven't seen or heard from in a while and you just have this feeling of wanting to send them a quick text, well, you can't do that with characters in the books. So when I talk about books that I've read in the past here, or when I'm talking about them with friends, or I see other people mentioning them, it's like that feeling of thinking about an old friend and wanting to connect with them again. And the only way to do that is to reread that book. Now, admittedly, my feelings about rereading have changed a little bit since starting BookTube, and I don't think that that is a unique viewpoint or a unique comment from someone who is a booktuber. Everyone always talks about how their reading habits changed, and I don't feel that that is dissimilar to my experience. I do have a little bit more pressure to be exposed or to read new, different, or broader variety of books than I did before having a channel, and that's because I want to be able to talk about new, different books here. And of course, there's a little bit of wanting to keep up, or you hear about certain books, but really it's less about that for me and more about not wanting to recommend the same 5 books over again, and to be able to have a broader variety of books that I can talk to you about with you guys. In fact, it was really only when I started my channel that I realized, even though I've been a reader for my whole life, I have very few books that I can talk about here or recommend to you that I didn't read in the past couple years when my reading really ramped up. And that's because, turns out, I have been rereading the same series and same authors over and over again for my entire life. And this, of course, has to do with the fact that when I was little, we lived in a really small town. We went to a bigger city that had a big bookstore, like a Chapters, twice a year, in August for back to school shopping and in December for Christmas shopping. And that is when I bought new books. And in the months in between that, I just reread those same books over and over again. And in fact, some of my favorite series are the books that I bought when I was really young, like a very young teenager or preteen, that I have been rereading basically every year for my entire life. And since I brought them up, I will share those series with you now. So I'll start off with some of my original favorite series. One of these is the Cristio's Legacy series by Jacqueline Carey. This is 3 separate sets of trilogies, but I don't really include the 3rd trilogy, which I haven't even completed, in my favorite series. I'm really just talking about the first trilogy, Phaedra's trilogy, and Imriel's trilogy. Now, this is a series that I think gets misinterpreted as a fantasy romance book or a book that has a lot of sex in it because of the setup, but in fact I think that the romance is actually plays pretty second fiddle, even third fiddle, to the overall world plot and like the story that is happening. The setup here, of course, is that our main character Phaedra is a courtesan spy, and she has been kind of chosen or touched by one of their gods so that she perceives pleasure from pain, and so she is also a BDSM courtesan spy. Phaedra is your classic unlikely hero. The first third of the book, she actually comes across very spoiled. She cares a lot more about being the, top-rated courtesan in her city. That is her goal. Those are her priorities. She is a little bit spoiled and very luxurious, but something happens in the world and she is really forced to step up. And that is when Phaedra shines. Phaedra is one of my favorite characters of all time. I know her so well, and it is written in that past tense storytelling, first person perspective, where Phaedra is telling her story after the fact. And if that is a storytelling style that you really like, I would definitely consider checking this book out. But at the heart of this story is an unlikely hero who is not a warrior, but who is so smart and ingenious, and who solves problems using her intellect and through her wit, and a little bit is that femme fatale, perfect, everybody wants to be with her kind of a character. So if you're okay with those things and you want like a really interesting, drama-filled, lots of political intrigue kind of a story, you have to check out the Cristio's Legacy series, specifically Phaedra's story. Now, the second trilogy follows Imriel, who is Phaedra's adopted child. This series is a little bit darker because Imriel has a very traumatic past and he has a very difficult life. But this is one of my favorite books and a series that I come back to time and time again, despite its flaws. In fact, I reread the first 5 books again in 2020 just because I wanted to be with Phaedra and Jocelyn and Imriel and all of my favorite characters again. Return viewers will probably not be surprised to hear that the Seven Water series by Julia Marulia is also a series that I have reread a lot. This is another series where it is made up of 2 trilogies, and I do not include the second trilogy as a favorite or one that I reread quite often. I'm talking about the original trilogy here in the Seven Waters series that I have reread over and over and over again, and admittedly, yes, I do read Daughter of the Forest way more than the other 2. And this is a historical fantasy series set in Ireland. In the first book, we follow Saoirse, and the first book is a Seven Swan Brothers, or like the Swan Brothers story. It's a fairy tale retelling of that story by the Brothers Grimm. And from there, the series becomes a generational series, where in the second book, we are following a child of Saoirse, and then another generation below that in the third book. Despite the fact that each of those 3 books are a little bit bittersweet and very sad, I do find myself returning to them time and time again because I think that the writing is so beautiful. Other than Saoirse, who is like one of my original favorite characters and I love her story, the other 2, it's less about returning to that character again with the generational component. It's not necessarily the characters that you're going back to see again. In this one, it's more about the setting. The setting of Seven Waters is one of my favorite settings in a book ever, and I just have to read the first few paragraphs in Daughter of the Forest to immediately feel immersed in that world again. Despite the fact that this is not a period of time in Ireland that I would actually want to live there, this is the setting that if I could live in any book setting ever, it would be the Seven Waters Forest. That is how much I love this forest. And Juliet Marilli's ability to write this wonderfully environmental and whimsical setting in the Seven Waters series. We're gonna jump out of fantasy for a minute here to talk about my next common reread from a young age, and that is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This is my favorite ultimate revenge story. This is the book that made me realize how much I like to read revenge stories. And not in like the Tao, Rage of Dragons, not gonna go down that track, kind of a revenge story, but in the intricate details of weaving this web of deception and slowly beguiling the people that you are trying to get back at into this web and into traps to take them down. That is the ultimate revenge story. and I love Count of Monte Cristo because of that. I have also always described this book as the ultimate desert island book, and that is because it is so long. The story changes so much over the course of this extremely long book that I think if you were trapped on a desert island and you had only one book to read over and over again for the rest of your life or however long you are trapped there, this is the book to have, because you could theoretically finish this book and pick it up again, and it is so long and so different at the end of the book than it is at the beginning that it would feel like reading a brand new book over again. It's also the kind of book that you get so much out of every time you reread it. There are so many different things that you realize about the story, about the plot, about the revenge, about the world, the history, the setting, whatever it is. There's so much more to discover each time you read that book. And even though it is a big, thick, chunky, involved book, even despite all of that, it is one that I love to reread. And then we'll jump back into fantasy for my last original reread book, and this is the fantasy series that got me into fantasy reading. That is the Fianna Bar Tapestry by Guy Gabriel Kay. Now, admittedly, this is a series that I don't think I want to reread anymore, and that is because I'm a little bit afraid of what I will find when I go back there. But this is the book that got me into fantasy reading. My mom gave it to me for Christmas when I was 12, and I basically reread the whole trilogy every year for the next 10 years? Now, because this book was like the series, the characters, the world that got me into adult fantasy reading, it was that original trilogy for me. Because of all of that, it has such a wonderful, like, little niche carved out place in my heart. I will never not have a copy of this book. This is a book that I actually would buy fancy, expensive special editions of, even if I didn't reread it ever again. But these characters, this world, was fantasy for me when I was a young reader. Now, those are the original series that I have read a gazillion times, or like an uncountable amount of times since I was a young child. And now I'm going to switch into some of the series or the books that I've been exposed to or that I read for the first time in the past couple years that I have already been rereading and that I will continue to reread. And I'll start off with a really cozy comfort read here with Radiance by Grace Draven. This is a fantasy romance book about a political marriage where the two involved here are of a different species, and they're both sort of like terrified and extremely unattracted in the other person. And what results is like a very bland, minimal, light plot, but just the healthiest relationship that I have ever read, as Brishan and Ildiko spend the book very slowly just becoming friends, going into their marriage with honesty and friendship and respect and mutual understanding, and they grow to slowly love each other and to become attracted to each other over time. Now, admittedly, this is a book where when I reread, I really only read scenes pertaining to the relationship development between Brishan and Ildiko. And you'll notice as I get further into, or like the newer rereads, that a lot of rereads I don't actually read every line in the book, and this is definitely one of those books. Another one is Crown of Midnight and Heir of Fire, books 2 and 3 in the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas. Now, these books this series I read for the first time in 2020, and they immediately became comfort rereads for me, but not the whole series. There was something about Sarah J. Maas's ability to write a developing relationship that really speaks to me. And in Crown of Midnight and Heir of Fire, there are two particular relationships happening. One is romantic, one is friendship that eventually turns romantic, but it's the friendship component that I like in that book. But the way that she writes these growing relationships in these two books really, really gets me. Now, I don't reread these books in their entirety. As I mentioned in Crown of Midnight book number 2, I really only read up until a certain character death and like that particular event. I really just stick to the first part of the book when the relationship development is the focus. And in Heir of Fire, I don't read all of the POVs. It's in this third book that we start to really expand the amount of points of view that we get in this book. I sometimes read Chaol's. I definitely don't read Dorian's. I don't read Edian's. I'm not actually sure if we get that. I don't read Manon's. Not that I dislike Manon. It's just not why I'm picking this book up again. I reread Selena or Aelin's story, little moments there, and as I said, sometimes pieces of Chaol's. But there are some times when I'm just in the mood to reread the development of those relationships. Now, another Sarah J. Maas book that, again, I only read a certain book in this series over and over again, and I only reread parts of it, is A Court of Mist and Fury. Now, this one is single POV, so obviously I do read all of the points of view as just Feyre's here, but I only start at the wedding scene and I stop reading basically after the cabin scene. So I don't read the full book here, I just read the middle portion. But again, it's because the development of the relationship and like all of the feelings involved there is this really cozy, comforting experience. All three of these Sarah J. Maas books and these relationships as they're being developed, it's about that cozy, comforting experience. And when I want something that just feels really light and cozy and comforting, it's often these books that I'm picking up and just rereading those parts. So those are all of the series that I am constantly rereading, whether or not I have been rereading them for the past, 15 years or just the past couple years. Now, I wanted to finish out this chat today by talking about whether or not you're a rereader, or if you aren't a rereader, why aren't you? I'm also so curious about people who don't reread even their favorite books, and I'm really curious about why that is. Is it that you don't want to go back to possibly ruin that? Is it just that, again, like the priority is to move on to see new books? On one hand, I understand the not wanting to ruin an old favorite. I'm definitely feeling that a lot with the Fianna Bar Tapestry series by Gabrielle Kay. Watching my friend Taylor read, I think this is the first 2 books so far in that trilogy, and hearing her thoughts about it has made me really not want to pick those books up again, just because I do think that I will interpret a lot of what happens, that I will perceive things very differently, that I will maybe feel differently about original beloved characters because I'm now seeing them through the eyes of a 30-year-old instead of a 12 or 16-year-old. And I don't want to ruin the feelings that I have about that really, really beloved series. So if you are not a rereader, is it because you don't want to waste your time? Is it because you, with a favorite, for example, you don't want to possibly delve more into flaws? Or do you just remember books that well? I definitely do not. While there are some series here, I think you'll probably know which ones, I can tell you the plot points piece by piece by piece. That is not the case for newer books that I have only read once. So yeah, I'm just really curious about what other people feel or how other people feel about rereading. If you are a rereader like me, I'd love to know if our reasons for that are similar, if it is something that you do as often as I do, or if it is less so, just with a few or a couple of different books that you will occasionally reread, and you could definitely count how many times you're doing it. Or if you're not a rereader, I want to know why. I'm so curious because I think it is such a different reading experience than my reading experience has been in my lifetime, and also probably your motivations behind reading. As I said, I am in a weird point now where I don't feel like I have as much time to reread. I feel a little bit more guilty about rereading certain books when I feel like I should be picking up new books in order to talk to you guys about them. But I also am now actively planning to reread certain books that I haven't read in a really long time because I want to be able to tell you guys about certain books, and I haven't read them in such a long time. I want to be able to accurately talk about the themes, so the feeling, the vibe, the plot, whatever, the keywords, as you will, about those books. So I do feel, in some sense, a little bit of pressure to reread those books before I even introduce you guys to the idea of them. But that is getting off topic, and I cannot, for the life of me, promise you guys those certain 2 videos that I mentioned again. So I will wrap up the conversation here. Let me know what you guys are thinking about rereading, if this is something you do or don't do and why. If you have comments or if you've read some of my OG rereading books, let me know. I would love to hear about that. I will see you guys in my next video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and I will see you guys later. Have a great day. Bye.